Okay. Please turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 10. We're going to talk about a guy, and we're going to look at his experience. Now, I have some other messages coming in the future that it'll be important that we've already looked at this guy. Then that way I just have to refer back to him, and you'll already remember what ground we covered when we talk about Cornelius. Cornelius is a Gentile, and it was at his home that the Gentile church received the gift of the person of the Holy Spirit. And that's something that we will get into in another study. But you'll remember that the person of the Holy Spirit was given to the Jewish church on the day of Pentecost. And as a result, the people spoke in tongues. And then the same gift was given at Cornelius' household. So you have the gift of this person of the Holy Spirit being given to the Jewish church on Pentecost. And as we're going to see, you have the gift of the person of the Holy Spirit given to the Gentile church at Cornelius' household. Now, this morning I don't want to look at the Gentile church. I just want to look at Cornelius, because there's some interesting things about Cornelius, especially in light of what most churches teach relative to how you become a child of God. Very interesting case study, because here is a Gentile that we can see, because of characteristics of this Gentile, how the modern theory just falls apart just by looking at Cornelius. And as I say, he was the one that was chosen to be the head of the Gentile church that Peter preached to. Now, the first thing that I want you to see is over in Acts chapter 15 and verse 7. Acts chapter 15 and verse 7. Excuse me. And when there had been much disputing, this is at a time when they're arguing back and forth as to whether or not Gentiles have to be circumcised. And when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, Men and brethren, ye know how that a good while ago God made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. Well, that's a direct reference to guess who? Cornelius. Cornelius was a Gentile that heard the gospel by the preaching of Peter. But what we need to understand is he did not hear the preaching of the gospel when we start to look at Cornelius. It wasn't until after God sent for him that Peter came. So what we want to do is look at Cornelius before he ever heard the preaching of the gospel, and see who this man was, and see what his characteristics were. And I think you'll see something interesting if you've never seen this before. So in Acts chapter 10, let's read through it. It's kind of a long read. We'll get down to, well, we'll read until I get tired of reading, and then we'll go back and take a look. But I want you to be able to see the flow here. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. Now, that's not a rock and roll band. That's referring to the army unit that he was in. A centurion is about equal with a captain in the army today. So he's a man that has a good number of men underneath his control, and the unit that he is over is called the Italian band. Okay, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. he saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto them, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa, and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. Okay, so here we have Cornelius. The Bible says he was a devout man. A devout man means a godly man, a pious man. Let's compare this with something. Look at Acts chapter 22 and verse 12, talking about Ananias. It says, And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there. Cornelius was a devout man. He was a godly man. Look also at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. Second Peter 2 and verse 9 says, The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. Interesting point here. Cornelius, at this point in his life, has never heard of Jesus Christ, and yet the Bible says he was a devout man and one that feared God. Okay? Let's look at the next. A devout man and one that feared God with all his house. Over in Proverbs chapter 8, the fear of the Lord is defined. Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 13. Here's the definition for you. This is what the fear of the Lord is. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogancy, and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. That's the fear of the Lord. A man that fears God hates evil, hates sin, hates pride, hates arrogancy. That is Cornelius. He was a man that feared God. Now, you say, okay, so what? I fear God too. Well, there's an interesting point about that. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 13. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 13. It says, But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. The wicked don't fear, they don't fear God. They have no fear of God. They don't hate evil, they rather love it. When you understand this, it explains so much. When you see somebody, especially a politician in these days and ages, stand up and tell a bald-faced lie that everybody on planet Earth knows the guy's lying about, and he just says it just as straight-faced as you could, because he has no shame. They don't fear God. The wicked don't have that fear. They don't have that conscience that yanks at them and says, hey, buddy, you know, that's not true. They don't care. The wicked don't fear God. They don't hate evil. They don't hate pride and arrogancy. They rather love it. Cornelius feared God. Well, what are we starting to see here? Maybe Cornelius wasn't wicked, and yet Cornelius still had never heard the gospel. It hadn't come to him yet. In Romans chapter 3, And verse 18, Romans 3:18 says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, who are we talking about? Well, we go back here to verse 10. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. Boy, there's a pretty picture, isn't it? You open your mouth and it's like looking down a grave. That's really a nice picture, right? This is a description of men that are not born again. Now, actually, he's describing people in the church here, but it's still those of us prior to being born again. This is a description of them. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. Now that's a description of people in the world. Wasn't Cornelius in the world? He'd never heard the gospel, and yet he doesn't match this. Because he does have the fear of God before him. And he's a devout man. In Jeremiah chapter 32, we start to put the pieces together here. Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 38 through 40. Jeremiah 32:38. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God, and I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and of their children after them. You see, the reason that some people fear God is because God gave them a heart that they could fear him. And Cornelius had been given a heart that he could fear God, which is why he was a devout man. But remember, chronologically, he still has not heard anything about Jesus Christ. And yet he's a devout man that fears God because God had given him a heart so that he could fear him. Now let's consider the state of those who fear God. If you fear God this morning, if when you sin it bothers you and it troubles you and you mourn over it and you wish you hadn't done it and your conscience drives you crazy, then you're someone that fears God. Remember, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Well, if you hate evil, then you fear God. So let's consider a little bit about those who fear God. Turn first to Psalm 103. Psalm 103, and first we're going to look at verse 13. Psalm 103:13. Like a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. Now we have some fathers in the room, and we have some people that have never been fathers in the room. We got some mothers in here too, so they would understand, but let me try to give you just a sense of this a little bit. And I'm going to pick on my son back there in the back of the room, because he's easy prey at this point. One of the houses that Wendy and I lived in when we lived in California, right behind it was a big Mormon church. And it seems like they have one set of plans. Mormons have one set of plans, and they build the same building wherever they build it. They all look the same. And they always have a huge parking lot. But there's never any cars in the parking lot except on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights, and when they have something going on. The rest of the time the parking lot's vacant. And it's a wonderful place for little kids to go ride their bicycles in the parking lot of the Jehovah's Witness church because there's nothing to really to hit. And so they jump over curves and they try to catch air and they play around. And so one time, I don't remember how old Josh was, he was a little guy. Blake came riding home as fast on his bike as fast as he possibly could. I was out in the front yard or in the garage doing something, and Blake came up and said, "I think Josh is dying." And so I put Blake in the car, and we drove around the corner to the Jehovah's Witness church, and there was Josh all clumped up on the concrete. And he looked up at me and asked, "Dad, am I going to die?" And I thought, well, I don't think so. So we scooped him up and had Blake ride his bicycle home and took him home and gave him to his mom. See, that's how a father pitieth his children. He worries about them. He cares about them. When they get a boo-boo on their knee, he fixes it. When they get into trouble, he tries to help them get out. That's how a father pitieth his children, and God pities his children the same exact way. Those that fear him. Now, not so much for the ones that don't fear him, but if you're one that fears God, then you fall into this category. Let's look at something else. Look at verse 17. Psalm 103, verse 17. But the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting upon them that fear him, and his righteousness unto children's children. To those that fear him. And we know that Cornelius feared him. Over in Psalm chapter 147 and verse 11. Psalm 147, 11. The Lord taketh pleasure in them that fear him, in those that hope in his mercy. The Lord's merciful to those that fear him. And Cornelius did. Now notice, he takes pleasure in them, which means that God is pleased with them. Right? If you take pleasure with something, you're pleased by that. Look at Romans chapter 8, because we'll see an interesting thing about those that are in the world. Let's take a look at lost people here. Romans chapter 8 and verse 8. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please God. So a lost man cannot please God, but God is pleased by those who fear him. Well, what's the conclusion? Apparently Cornelius wasn't a lost man. He'd never heard the gospel, but he wasn't lost. Another point that we see over in Acts, back over in Acts chapter 10, where we began this. Acts chapter 10, we're going to look at verse 2 and verse 4. A devout man and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. And in verse 4, and when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. Alms are charitable relief of the poor. And giving alms goes hand in hand with fearing God. It's one of the, look at Leviticus chapter 25. Leviticus chapter 25, we're going to begin at verse 35. Leviticus 25:35, and if thy brother be waxen poor and fallen in decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve him. Yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee, take thou no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. In the Old Testament days, A Jew was not allowed to charge interest of another Jew. You were required to help your brother out, but you were not allowed to charge interest. You were not allowed to profit off of it, because God was the one that was going to make sure that you had increase when you had increase. Now, you could charge interest of a Gentile, but you couldn't do it of a Jew. This is the reason why Christ overthrew the tables of the money changers in the temple. Because what were those people doing? They had come to the conclusion that the only kind of money that could be put in the temple treasury was temple money. So let's call that, for sake of discussion, German Deutschmarks. We have to pay in German Deutschmarks. How many of those, anybody got those in your pocket right now? No, you got dollar bills in your pocket right now. So you would have to go to the temple and exchange your dollar bills for German Deutschmarks and put the German Deutschmarks in the temple treasury. But when you exchange your $1 bill for the Deutschmark, they don't give you even money. You got to give us $2 to get one Deutschmark. And they kept the difference. And the money changers kept the difference. So God had made the rule back in Leviticus, you don't charge interest to you don't do it. And they were doing it to other Jews. And that was the big thing with the money changers. But again, notice, hand in hand with fearing God goes along with paying alms and taking care of the poor. God even designed it in such a way that when you had a field, when you planted fig trees or orange trees or whatever, fruit trees, that when you harvested, you didn't harvest around the outside. You left that open for strangers so that when they came through, they could have something to eat. And you didn't glean it down to the point there was nothing left. I remember I had a friend that was an almond farmer out in California, and they would shake those trees until there was nothing left on them. They'd go through with the first shaking and get some, and then they'd come through and shake them a bunch more times to get all of them off of there. Well, that's not the way God designed it. At least in old Israel, you go in and get your first harvest, but there's always fruit left behind after the first harvest. You don't get everything. Well, in God's country back then, leave that for the poor folk, because they got to eat too. And he was, in that sense, was taking care of people, and that was part of the old law. These are just things you didn't do, and they went hand in hand with fearing God, because if you feared God, you would do what God told you to do, and you wouldn't take advantage. Look at Luke chapter 18. Now, we're only going to look at a couple of these verses, verses 1 and 2. The point I want to make here is that the fear of God tends to lead us to regard our fellow man, because we're going to look at an example of the opposite. We're going to look at somebody that didn't fear God and had no regard for his fellow man. So the converse would be true if you did fear God. In Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, and he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man. Those that don't fear God don't regard man. You see, this is one of the really bad parts about the folks that stand up like politicians and try to convince you that they care about you. They don't care about you. They don't regard you at all. You're just a vote. You're just somebody that I'm going to try to manipulate to vote me in so that I get more power again. Just like this unjust judge. But that was not Cornelius. Look at Proverbs 29 and verse 7. Proverbs 29:7, if a wise man contendeth with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there's no rest. That can't be what I was intending to read. Verse 7, the righteous considereth the cause of the poor. I got dyslexic there for a minute. At least I was in the right place. Just read the wrong verse. The righteous considereth the cause of the poor, but the wicked regardeth not to know it. Well, wait a minute. Cornelius considered the poor by giving alms. Does that not argue that he was righteous? If the righteous considereth the cause of the poor, and in doing so by giving alms to them, are we not starting to see that Cornelius was already a just man? That Cornelius already feared God, that he gave alms, that he considered the poor? Here's another one. Look back at Acts chapter 10 again. And we're going to read the same verse. We're going to look at verse 2. Through 4. A devout man and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision evidently about the 9th hour of the day an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And when he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. His prayers got through. God heard his prayers. Look at verse 31, same chapter, Acts 10:31. And said, Cornelius, thy prayer is heard, and thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. Cornelius' prayers got through and God heard them. Well, that might not mean much to a lot of folks, but if you understand that God doesn't hear the prayer of the wicked, it means quite a bit. It means a lot. Proverbs chapter 59. I'm sorry, Proverbs chapter 15. There I go again. 15:29. Proverbs 15:29. The Lord is far from the wicked, but in contrast, he heareth the prayer of the righteous. God hears the prayer of the righteous. He's far from the wicked. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12, for the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. Again, another mark that Cornelius appears to be a righteous man. Look back at Acts chapter 10. Let's read a little bit farther down. We got down to verse 6. Let's read from 7 down through 18. And when the angel which spake unto Cornelius was departed, he called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. On the morrow, as they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. And when he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance, and saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners, and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that is common or unclean. Remember, Peter's a Jew. And so there were certain dietary laws that the Jews followed, and there were certain things you don't eat. Creeping things is one of them. That's the easiest to point out. But there's certain animals you just don't eat. So here comes this sheet, and it's full of all kinds of creatures, clean and unclean both, at least according to Jewish law. And the voice says, kill and eat, and Peter says, no, man, I don't eat that stuff. Why? Well, because he'd been raised a Jew, and Jews don't eat that stuff. Now, there's a parallel that we're going to get to here, because, you see, there's something else that Jews were not allowed to do. They were not allowed to enter the home of a Gentile. They would defile themselves if they entered the home of a Gentile. So here we have this picture of the sheep that comes down with all these animals. God tells him to eat. He says, don't eat stuff that's unclean. And in verse 15, it says, And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. This was done thrice. 3 times this happened. And the vessel was received up again into heaven. Now, while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen should mean, behold, the men which were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house, and stood before the gate, and called and asked whether Simon, which was surnamed Peter, were lodged there. While Peter thought on the vision, the Spirit said unto him, Behold, 3 men seek thee. Arise therefore, and get thee down, and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. Then Peter went down to the men which were sent unto him from Cornelius, and said, Behold, I am he whom ye seek. What is the cause wherefore ye are come? Let's just continue reading for a bit. And they said, Cornelius the centurion, a just man. What does that mean? If he's just, that means he's justified. A just man, and one that feareth God, and of good report among all the nation of the Jews, was warned from God by a holy angel to send for thee into his house, and to hear words of thee. Now that's, when you think about, and when you understand the doctrine, does this not look a lot like how churches get started? You get some people that all of a sudden have a hankering for God, and God sends somebody to them to preach the gospel. Same thing that happened with Cornelius. Cornelius was justified long before he was temporally saved by the gospel. His soul had been saved long before Peter ever even showed up. And if you think of the vision of the sheet that came down, it's very possible that Peter might have said, I can't go in that house. That's a house of a Gentile. I can't go in there. I can't defile myself by going in there. No, he went in there because God had said, go do it. But the guy that was in there was already one of God's children. So the point that I'm making here is that Cornelius had been cleansed. Look at what it says again in verse 15. What God hath cleansed, that call thou not common. Cornelius had been cleansed, and he was the purpose for Peter going there. In Acts 10 and verse 35, we read, and this is Peter speaking of what occurred at Cornelius' household. Look at verse 34. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Cornelius worked righteousness. He was accepted of God, and he feared him. Now look at 1 John chapter 2 and verse 29. 1 John 2 and verse 29. If ye know that he is righteous, ye know that every one that doeth righteousness is born of him. Cornelius did righteousness before he ever even heard the gospel. And the Bible said he was born of him. You see, he was already a child of God long before Peter ever showed up. And it was God that made him a child of God, not Peter. It wasn't the preaching of Peter that made him a child of God. He was there before Peter ever knocked on the door. And we just read in Acts 34 and 30, or chapter 10, 34 and 35 that every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. So Cornelius was accepted of God. Look at Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 6. To the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he, that's God, hath made us accepted in the beloved, that's Christ. Cornelius was accepted by God and was in Christ. And Peter's still out on the street, making his way to his house. So therefore, before Cornelius heard and believed the gospel, he gave evidence of already being in Christ, of already being justified, of already being born again. Look at Matthew chapter 7. Verses 15 through 20. Matthew 7, 15 through 20. Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. All you got to do is watch a person for a while and you start to get, anybody can fake something for 6 months. But after a while, you get to the point where you can't fake it anymore. That's why it's important that you be two things. That for those of you that may be thinking of marriage someday, or, get to know the person, hang out for a while, because they can lie to you for a few months, but pretty soon the real person is going to actually show themselves, and you'll be able to figure it out, and you can tell, you'll know them by their fruits. And B, this is just advice that I've learned over the years, get to know their parents real well. Really get to know who their parents are, because the person you're marrying is going to be their parents the first time you get in a fight. That's right, the first time you get in an argument, you're going to meet her mother, the worst side of her mother, and the worst side of her father combined. So get to know them well, and before so you can say, yeah, I could handle that. And then, but you will know them by their fruits. How Cornelius, what do we know about Cornelius? Well, he was a righteous guy. He gave alms. He prayed. His prayers were heard. He had the characteristics and the fruit of someone that looked like a Christian. There have been stories that I've heard for years. Elder Gerald used to talk about them, where back in the old days they'd send missionaries out into lands preaching the gospel, and they would come across people. In fact, we even heard this from a modern day missionary that we knew that wasn't even teaching our doctrine. But they would go out and they would preach this, and there would be people there living amongst whatever group of people you found that, you know, I mean, if they were Africans, well, they looked like everybody else, kinda, but they didn't live like everybody else. And if you just watched them, they lived kinda like a Christian. And then when you preach the gospel to them, their eyes got big, and they were the ones that responded, because they always knew there was something there, just like when Paul preached on Mars Hill and said, I feel you're too superstitious. There was apparently some sort of a little altar there on Mars Hill to the unknown God, and people would come by and leave trinkets or whatever on top of it, because they really didn't know what the unknown God wanted, but they knew he was there. And Paul declared that the unknown God was Jesus Christ. Yeah, he is there. You just don't know anything about him. Same with Cornelius. Cornelius knew there was a God. Cornelius was doing the best he could to serve that God, but he didn't know how God wanted him to be served until Peter came along. And it was God that sent Peter to give the word, to tell him. And here's one right here too, in Acts chapter 10, verses 5 and 6. I want you to notice Cornelius didn't wait around. Acts 10, 5 and 6. Well, look at verse 4, and then we'll follow it in. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said unto him, "Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa, and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do." Verse 7, and when the angel which spake unto Cornelius was departed, Cornelius sat around for another 6 or 7 months thinking about it. Is that what your Bible says? No. It says, when the angel was departed, he called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. He didn't wait. There was something that he knew he needed to do, so he did it. He didn't wait. He was obedient. He was obedient to what he was told to do. And when you're obedient to what you're told to do, then you get more. What if he had said, I'm not going to sin for him? You know, I'm just not going to do it. Well, then you wouldn't have heard the gospel, would you? And you wouldn't have gotten what you would have gotten out of that. But Cornelius needed to hear about Christ so that he could correctly understand God and worship him the way God wants to be worshiped. In John chapter 4, John chapter 4, verse 24. We read, God is a spirit. Now Christ is talking to the woman at the well, and he says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, Cornelius didn't know how to worship God in truth, and God doesn't accept it any other way. He doesn't take whatever you think you want to come up with and count that as worship. You might be one of his children, and he might be looking over you, but whatever you're doing, don't count as worship if you're not doing it in truth. And that's what Christ said in 1 John chapter 5. I mean, if we think back to the golden calf, you know what those people were trying to do in the wilderness when they made that calf and were having an orgy around the calf? They were trying to worship the God of heaven. It's how they thought they should do it. It's what they were taught in Egypt, and they fell back into the old way and thought that God was going to accept that. He's supposed to accept that kind of worship? Well, he didn't, and Moses didn't care too much about it either. You see, you can't just pick and choose how you're going to go about worshiping God. You're either worshiping him the way he wants to be worshiped, or you're not. And Cornelius didn't know how to go about doing it. And so that's what Peter was going to come and tell him. In 1 John, see where am I? Chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. And we know that the Son of God is come and hath given us an understanding that we may know him that is true, and we are in him that is true, even in his Son, Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. Why do you suppose he says that? Well, because if you don't know truth and you don't worship in truth, you know where you're going to end up? You're going to end up in idolatry. So keep yourself from that. How do you keep yourself from that? By knowing what God wants and giving him the type of worship that he wants. That keeps you away from idolatry. Now, Peter was going to show this God-fearing man how he could perfect his obedience. That's why Peter was sent. In Romans chapter 16, verses 25 and 26, we see what he was sent to do. Now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. That's what Peter was sent to do, to show these Gentiles what it was that God wanted. And this was the first entrance of the gospel into the Gentiles. And by obeying what he knew he would do, Cornelius would learn more. Because that's how you learn more. If you're obedient to what you know you should do, you'll get more. I remember I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and I don't remember who it was I was talking to, but I remember it being in Las Vegas in what year was that? 1987. Wendy and I had only been married a couple of months. We were there with the intent of being baptized. And at that time, back when Pastor Mott was the pastor in Las Vegas, and he would only come out 3 or 4 times a year. When he would come out, well, there would be church on Friday night, and then it wasn't church, it was a Bible study, and then there was a Saturday morning and a Saturday afternoon and a Saturday evening session, and then church on Sunday morning with communion. And that's kind of the way it worked. And you'd have breaks in between here. And it was after the Saturday afternoon break, I think that the people that we knew there, and Wendy and I, we went somewhere. Don't even remember where it was. It was like a park of some sort. I don't think I could ever even find it again. But Wendy had some questions. She was questioning whether or not she should actually get in the water. It was kind of scary for her. My mind was made up, but she was still kind of wondering. And there were still some things that she questioned. And the guy that was there said, you just do it, and when you come up, the answers will be there, but you're not going to see the answers till you do. You remember that? And she got in the water, and the answers were there when she came out of the water. That's how it works, folks. If you're obedient to what you know you're supposed to do, God will give you more. And then when you're obedient to that, God will give you more. And the longer you go, the more you get, as long as you're obedient to what God gave you the last time. When you decide, nah, that's as far as I'm going, well, that's as far as you're ever going to know anything. You've grown as much as you're going to grow. You are now a stunted tree that won't bear as much fruit as it could have had you just been obedient. So, and this was the thing that Cornelius needed. He needed somebody to tell him what to do so he could be obedient, so that he could move forward. And Cornelius would be saved by these words that Peter brought him. Over in Acts chapter 11, verses 13 through 14. Acts 11, 13 and 14. We're here, now he's recounting, Peter's recounting what happened. He says, and he showed us how that he had seen an angel in his house, which stood and said unto him, send me to Joppa, and call for Simon, whose surname is Peter, who shall tell thee words whereby thou and all thy house shall be saved. You see, there was a salvation in this. And in Acts chapter 16, verses 30 and 31, we have the story of the Philippian jailer. And in verse 30 it says, and brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house. Here we have two occasions of believing the gospel and you're saved from it. But here's my question. What salvation is it? Is it eternal salvation? Well, it could be, I suppose, except that would create a bunch of contradictions with a bunch of other verses in the Bible. But what does this word saved actually mean? If you look it up in a dictionary, what does the word save mean? It means to be delivered from something. And it means the same thing in the Bible. If we look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 21, Acts 2, 21, where it says, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Okay? Famous passage. Now, that is actually a quote. Peter is quoting a prophecy by Joel. And this is a quote. Now, look back at Joel chapter 2. And Joel is a tiny book right in between Hosea and Amos, if that helps you. Joel chapter 2, and we're going to look at verse 32. And now you stay there in Joel. Let me read this again from Acts, and then I'll read it from Joel so that you can see it right back to back. In Acts chapter 2:21, it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. In Joel chapter 2, verse 32, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. You see, being saved and being delivered are the same thing. Well, delivered from what? If this is going to deliver me from something, what's it going to deliver me from? Because you can be delivered from a bunch of stuff. You can be saved from a bunch of stuff. You ever heard anybody talk about that guy saved my life? Well, was that in eternal salvation? No, he just kept you from dying. There's all kinds of senses in which the word saved is used in the Bible. You can't just automatically assume that every time it says saved, it's talking about getting to heaven, because most of the times it's not. It's talking about something else. Now, the gospel does, in fact, have a saving effect to it. 1 Timothy chapter 4. And verse 16. Where Paul writes to Timothy, an ordained minister, somebody that was probably eternally saved before he was ordained, I would guess. I don't think I have to argue that point too much. In fact, Paul talked about, over in 2 Timothy, he talked about the unfeigned faith that was in him that began with his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded that in thee also. So Timothy obviously was eternally saved when Paul wrote these letters to him. But look what he says here. Take heed unto thyself and unto the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. Save himself from what? He was clearly already eternally saved. Well, save himself from ignorance, save himself from deception, save himself to fellowship. So just like with Timothy, Cornelius was already saved from the guilt and penalty of his sin, but he didn't know what God wanted him to do, and that's why Peter was there. Because just like with Cornelius, one must already be eternally saved before he can even hear and believe the gospel. You can't hear it and believe it if you're not already a child of God. Look first at John chapter 5. In verse 24. John 5:24. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life. So if you have the ability to hear it, and you have the ability to believe it, you're already in possession of eternal life. That's what the verse says. And you've already passed from death unto life. You have to already have that before you can hear and believe the gospel. Look also at 1 Corinthians 1:18. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. To the lost, the preaching of the cross is foolishness. But to those of us that are already saved, it's the power of God. That's when you can see it. You have to already be saved in order to see that. And if you're not already eternally saved, you can't receive the gospel message. It makes no sense to you. Look at John chapter 8. In verse 47. First, let's look at verse 43, and then we'll look at verse 47. Why Jesus talking to some Pharisees. Now, these Pharisees were not stupid people. Not in a secular sense. They were doctors of the law. They were the equivalent of a PhD. They were learned men. They'd gone to school. They understood. So we're not talking about some buffoon with a third grade education here. We're talking about somebody that can understand language, that can understand what's being taught. And notice, they can't understand Christ. Why do you not understand my speech? Even because you cannot hear my words. Now look at verse 47, because there's the explanation. He that is of God hears God's words. Ye therefore hear them not. Because you don't want to? Because you choose not to? No, because you're not of God. You see, if you're not of God, you can't understand the scriptures. You can't understand God's message. You can't understand the things of God if you're not already of God. Therefore, how in the world could you make it a requirement to understand the things of God in order to be a child of God if you can't understand it until you already are one? You can't. And then look also at 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14. First Corinthians 2:14. But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. You can't understand spiritual things unless you have spiritual life. Cornelius could understand, and Cornelius had spiritual life long before Peter ever had the vision of the sheet coming down and the words of God sending him to the place where Cornelius was. His job was to teach Cornelius what to do so that Cornelius could come into fellowship. And as it turns out, there were a great many in Cornelius' household that joined into him, and that became the first church, the first Gentile church. And we're running up on time. And so with that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. I'm not going to press this on for another week, but I might come back and hit bits and pieces of what I got left in the outline as we go forward. So thank you. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.